Welcome to Consensus Unreality. Today we will be concluding, for now, our Pulp Magic series. This will be episode 4 of Pulp Magic. We're here to discuss perhaps the central figure of this kind of investigation we've been undertaking. Probably not a big surprise to anyone. It is Aleister Crowley. Edward Alexander Crowley, born in 1875. Someone who's still a household name, more or less, without having really been well understood as a cultural force. Although, he has his place as a sort of satanic figure in the popular culture, someone who you can kind of appeal to as a boogeyman of sorts, or perhaps as like a liberationist kind of thinker, someone who is about free love. Even he was very popular in the 60s, around that sort of thing. But we're going to look at him today from the angle of somebody who was bridging this gap between the East and the West, the mysticisms of the recently sort of contacted, from the Western perspective, East, Asia, India, and the slowly and sort of strangely developing Western esoteric tradition, which post-Crowley really owes quite a bit to Crowley, and so then, of course, includes this Eastern influence. So we'll be looking at Crowley through a few angles in that way, and of course, as a sort of pulp figure himself. It's hard to think of somebody who fits that mold better. Accusations of espionage, drug addiction, sexual depravity, kind of beyond even what people use today as like scare tactics. If we really take everything people say about Crowley seriously, he's sort of a monstrous figure, and
almost beastly.
The great beast. I think we have at least one source who does take Crowley at his word for this episode. A source we've looked at before. But yeah, so where do you want to start today?
I think it'll be as kind of a layout to maybe we'll try and do the first portion public as our bow on this Pulp Magic series, which explored the East meets West connection in the 20th century occultism, when the burned over district had happened in New York, and there was kind of just this wellspring in the world of romantic occultism filling the void left by rationalism and the kind of reactionary and also the abandonment of Christianity. Like Crowley and Blavatsky share this relationship to Christianity, in that they were kind of trying to, take down the pillars of that religion. But it's ironic in a way because, the world was already kind of moving in that direction anyway, arguably. And it's almost that, their answer to that defiant call is sort of a reaction to the void left by its absence when it was extracted through rationalism, right, and the displacement of that world organization. I will also say there's a lot. We've been, I think on the tail end here, Ben and I have been looking at Aleister Crowley and the Hidden God by Kenneth Grant, which just has a lot of wonderfully gross stuff in it. And there's a lot of gross stuff with Crowley in general, so it'd be cool for the Patreon subscribers. We'll just do a big gross out, and we'll also continue our series talking about the Black Mass in film. I watched a wonderful movie that had some nods to French medieval Gnostic remnants in it, and starred a sacrificial starlet as well. So I'll be excited to talk about that in the Patreon post episode. So if you're not a subscriber to our Patreon, You may notice that we don't really do that many public episodes, but we do basically a weekly episode or so at patreon.com/consensus on reality. If we don't do weekly, we surely do long episodes on Patreon. And we get into a lot of weird stuff. This series, Pulp Magic, we've talked about T-Lob saying Rampa. We've talked about Theosophy and the sort of fire it lit on the world. And we talked about some strange connections to 20th century fiction, like The Mask of Fu Manchu, the questionable arch-villain of Sax Rohmer's fictional series. So it's been a really great series, and a couple of years ago we did something similar called Saucers of Despair, and I think visiting some of those episodes, if you haven't heard those, will be a nice companion to this series. And we probably recorded that about this time of the year, 2 years ago, I think, and our final episode in that was about sex magic, and sort of revisiting some of this subject matter and the materials that we used for that episode, but certainly looking at things in a different lens. I think really for me, this has been about, because we've talked about Crowley so much on the show. He's an unavoidable character, and I think we really, because we're not Thelemites, we're not acolytes of Crowley's teachings, though we find him interesting and certainly unavoidable if you have an interest in occult subjects, whatever your purpose with them is. So I think we've kind of gotten into the weeds of his character, on many different episodes, and also talked about unique workings that he did, such as the Abramelin working on the Loch Ness, of course, and we've talked about the Amalantra working in New York City, and the drawing of Lam, and of course the Babylon working, and Jack Parsons, and all of that stuff. But yeah, I think maybe we could kind of try and talk a little bit about Crowley's earlier biography to start with, because there's certainly stuff in there that I think people might not realize about this guy. He definitely came from, a very wealthy family.
Right.
He inherited,
Brewers.
yes, and he inherited about, when he was of age, he inherited probably what was about like $2.5 million or something like that. So I think that really is something to keep into the back of your head of like what would allow somebody to, live this adventurous, defiant life and, freely explore all of the topics that he did. Certainly early in life, he was a prolific mountain climber, one of the most well-known in the world, and, at different points of his life was on the verge of breaking mountain climbing records. Very well-traveled, well-read, studied at Cambridge, right?
I believe so. Or at least he said that he did. He certainly I think he had a poem published that was just published as like a student at Cambridge or something like that, a university man of Cambridge or something. So yeah, he was like a young, wealthy trust fund kid sort of, and it's fascinating to see where he ended up then. It's like it's a before and after picture that's almost like shocking.
Yeah, for sure. And some of the early influences, you obviously have the decadent writings, and I think the Oscar Wilde stuff comes up, especially when we consider the comparison to Oscar Wilde's pastiche biblical verses. are,
Mm.
a well comp to the writing style of the Book of the Law. Also, Nietzsche's
Huh.
"Thus Spoke Zarathustra" is kind of what Crowley was
Yeah.
sort of trying to achieve in his exposition of the Book of the Law. And I think we'll get into that scenario a little more. But I think that, the Oscar Wilde thing certainly paints the character of who Crowley would exemplify in his decadent character, often adorning like a fake accent and, calling himself a count and a duke and all of this stuff, and having letters
Yeah.
having to be addressed to him as certain titles and such.
Right. The name
Having
thing is really interesting. Like throughout his career, he must have had like dozens of pseudonyms and titles, and almost to the point where you don't really understand like who's writing sometimes in his books. Like it feels like, oh, does he have like a writing partner here? But it's really just like two aspects of him. And then sometimes he really was working with people. He's maybe willfully kind of obfuscating his voice, or he's just maybe it's this trickster kind of thing, or some kind of power obsession with like trying to get people to see him in different ways depending on what he's wanting. Um, yeah, and I guess it's also notable to mention that his parents were part of the Plymouth Brethren, which were more or less a Christian cult, or at least a rather extreme fundamentalist group. And I mean, so I feel like that it explains so much about him, both in what he was rebelling against and in his sort of apocalyptic vision of the world and these aeons that would he would serve a part in shuffling the world through. I think, I mean, not to get like psychoanalytic about it, but it seems like you could look at Crowley's life and biography and see a lot of echoes of this sort of well off, very privileged, but also sort of bizarre world he was born into.
Yeah, and he never abandoned that. Like I think we were talking in text about Crowley, and our daytime passing the time argument was if Crowley is a Satanist or not. And
Uh-huh.
I think my argument for why he is a Satanist is that, no matter how far he travels away from Christianity with the early influence of 1001 Arabian Nights, so much so that he, crowns Burke the early translator of those stories as a great priest of Thelema,
Right.
and the influence of Eliphas Levi as well, is a subversive Christian influence. But of course, he does at a certain point very seriously indulge yoga,
Oh yeah.
and I think one of the greatest things about Crowley is his ability to amalgamate these things. And I think that it's interesting to point out that, the vessels or the paths through which these Eastern influences are received to Crowley are thin and questionable. And if you look at them all, they're all pretty vaporous, and they're not really coming from authentic sources. Yet he amalgamates it all into this new idea, this new thing, which I think is his brilliance, is to sort of combine these different elements of spiritualism from across the world and amalgamate it
Yeah.
into something new. But it always is kind of spoken and delivered in this way that is anti-Christian, like especially if we look at the Book of the Law, it
Sure.
reads like a left-hand Revelations,
Yeah. No, the ghost of the Christian upbringing is always there in his life. And I still don't like, I mean, I think he even calls himself sort of, he wears the sort of cloak of Satan quite a lot and uses that imagery. But I'm just not sold that he is a Satanist in the sense that the word has come to be understood. Like somebody who is using Christianity but is doing its opposite, like as a sort of rebellious thing. Someone who believes truly in the world of the Christian, the Christian universe, and who is using that, but is like I know he says at certain points in his life that he is playing for the other team and stuff like that. Like, but so he's playing with this idea of Satanism 100% because when he was coming up, it was a big sort of taboo and exciting thing was like black masses and
Hmm.
occultism and Satanism. And so that's in his thing for sure. But I just don't know if that's the way that we can read his work is megalomaniacal for sure. And it's ego driven. And if that's satanic, then it's pretty satanic. It's all about absolute freedom against everyone else. And so in that way, it's almost like more satanic than LaVey, but he's using way too much Indian and other and like he's just I feel like he's too like syncretic. He's using too many other sources to be like a someone that we could sit down and say, hey, he's just a Satanist. Like,
Well,
he
yeah, that's clearly reductive, and I wouldn't
yeah,
agree with that either. But I would also push back on that and say, does that actually exist? In the way that these Hammer and British
right.
black mass films that we've been talking about, like, are there? I'm sure that there are. And I'm not going to argue against that. But how many like people are out there believing in the Christian doctrine and then using the left hand
Right.
path, like it's
I don't but
using
that's
the
like the
tools of it of the
yeah,
idea
that's
of
the charge, isn't it?
subversion.
Like
Um,
it's that they need like a priest to do the black mass. Like isn't that like kind of like the traditional
sure,
and
yeah.
they need like the implements of it, but like using a nude woman, like all this stuff that comes up like in Huysmans Labat, the classic like French pseudo like expose of black magic that turned him into like this. He was like the main decadent writer, Huysmans, J.K. Huysmans, and certainly someone Crowley had read, and the black mass stuff. Like he became like this hardcore like very meditative Catholic after his experience. Like he kind of went through this literary Catholic transformation through his body of work, through this like stand-in character for himself. And so I feel like that's I don't yeah, I'm not sure. Like we would need to do like this very detailed dissection of what constitutes true
I
Satanism
mean
versus what is
that,
just sort of like
yeah,
occultism.
yeah. We could have that could be a very fun or not fun episode because we might just be like, but actually,
Well,
like
it
the whole
is.
episode.
That's all it is.
I know, but like it's funny though. It's kind of ironic that I agree with you in that Crowley's syncretism of is very disparate, and you see the different sources as being so. But then Kenneth Grant, who takes the mantle from Crowley, kind of amalgamates it back into this like very subversive left hand path thing, where it's like, no, this is actually Shaitan, and this is the hidden god
Right.
is Set, who is the source of Satan and all this stuff.
Oh, I thought it was sex, not set.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, no, for sure. But I mean, even Grant is like it's black magic, but I don't know if it's Satanism. I think it's like dark magic.
he's
Uh,
yeah, no, it's somehow less so in that it's such a confusing house of mirrors. I think that's what's so fun about his books, and we talk about this,
yeah,
a lot. What makes him so compelling uh, is that it is so confusing where he stands, and his lack of own personal character and biography creates so much more of a sense of mystery. Whereas Crowley, uh, everything's pretty out in the open, and the contentious things about his character almost diminish what we actually know about his debauchery. which I think is the
Mm.
comical thing. Like the usual source of horror in Crowley is the people that champion him will always say, well, crazy people say that Aleister Crowley killed 1,001 children in a year, and he's obviously talking about masturbating, and it's like, sure, but if you read, the things that are included in the biographies of people who were relatively sympathetic to him, it's like pretty clear that this guy was like a pretty dark character who we would hold anybody, like we would hang them publicly for things that we know that he did, and yet he escapes these
Still
charges.
today?
I mean, there's some serious things that he has said himself, one of which is that he committed rape at the age of 14 of a house servant, which he
Right.
said himself on a radio show at Knife Point. I mean, isn't that charge
Yeah.
enough to, like, wouldn't that be enough today to be like, well, we're not going to follow the teachings of that guy? And
Yeah. Well, it's funny.
that's the
It's
thing
almost like
he
the
said,
yeah,
that
yeah,
there's other stuff that's like, more questionable when we get to the Abbey of Thelema in
for sure.
Cefalù, Italy, that that was more of an isolation state, although we have obviously journals of people who were there. But what they're
Yeah.
describing is a situation that, could have been some really bad stuff going on.
Yeah, but I think it's kind of funny. It's like no, almost no matter this is like a dumb comparison, but it's on everyone's mind, so I'm gonna like he has like this sort of charisma where it's like it doesn't really matter what he does. His like almost in like a Trump kind of way where it's like
It's not,
he just is like
but no,
he's
we would
historically.
crucify Trump if we knew that he did. We
I
don't.
don't think we would. Like I don't think so. I think charisma is I think in certain historical moments charisma is such that even if like people like you or me were sitting down and like hearing this like, well, this fuck this guy, I'm
Well,
done. There's still like this
I mean,
force of like
the other thing I'll bring up is, we save this for the back end of like bad shit. And it's not that like we're not going to say bad stuff about him on the public episode, but like, I think it's good to kind of paint an even picture because obviously his influence looms so largely, and there's certainly some brilliance to the things he did. Now I personally, I'd rather just steer the conversation away from is Crowley an evil guy or not, because I kind of think he was remarkable, but also like, a pretty horrendous human being. Like I
yeah,
mentioned, even
even yeah,
when he left, when he was with Leah Herzig and Norman Mudd, I believe his name was, who was an acolyte of his, and he just he's staying at this hotel after they get tossed out of Italy, because
yeah,
Mussolini is like, nah, no good.
right.
Uh, and it just says in the Simons biography, and I think Simons was like in charge of his estate, right? Like,
Yeah,
so
he was his
Simons,
literary executor.
exactly. So Simons is obviously not out to kill him, and it just clearly says in there, yeah, he was at a hotel and Crowley bought a young black boy and performed acts of sexual magic with him. And it's
There's a
like
lot
that
of a lot of
again, that is
that. Yeah.
enough to like people would just throw the baby out with the bathwater
Well, then
in
why don't I mean it's
most
in the official
situations.
biography.
Yeah. Well, because it
That's
doesn't
what I'm
get
that, yeah.
acknowledged and
I don't know. That's what I'm
to
saying about charisma.
yeah, but it's also the legacy. To Jason
But that
Horsley's,
is the legacy. Like
it's
it's in the
not. It's
it's in
not the
the Great
legacy. It's
Beast.
not talked. It's yeah, but that's nobody's really. I don't think people who follow the teachings of Crowley they're reading more of his personal works and especially like thelemic
Yeah.
works after that. They're not really focusing on the biography. And I think like,
I-
it's easy for people
yeah.
to say, well, the world was different at that time. And that's kind of what we're talking about with all of this shit. How different the world was and what, the scenarios were for these things to be able to happen. But at the
Yeah.
same time, I do think that it's almost that the hyper object of the evilness of Crowley And then people get past that and they tell themselves one layer of the story where they're like, well, he's not actually a Satanist. That's bullshit. He was just using that imagery and playing with people. And it's like, yeah, but then the stuff that he actually did that we know about is like detestable. And, you know,
Yeah, but is it like does that mean like Satanism is just like
no, I'm just
criminality?
so far away from, I'm not even saying it's
Yeah, yeah,
Satanism. I'm saying the crimes that he did.
yeah, yeah. It's
Like, and the neglect of human beings. And like, not even the stuff of like rape and torture as possible. Also the, like, just the wake of people that were close to him who went insane, committed
became drug
suicide,
addicts. Yeah,
became drug
totally.
addicts. There's like an anecdote of his 5-year-old, or yeah, his 5-year-old son, I think, at the Abbey of Thelema, just like being addicted to cigarette smoking and probably
Well,
drug use.
that's average for the day.
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think it
No, I'm just
was.
kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were out down in the coal mines smoking
See,
cigars.
that's that's not a good way to think about it, because that's just,
Of
it's
course
not
not.
a
I'm just
lot of
kidding.
that's not true. Yeah.
Um, no, of course he's yeah, I've been paging through The Great Beast by John Simons or Simmons, however you say it. And it's like, and then comparing that to Jason Horsley's Vice of Kings, and what the Great Beast book says, the sort of official literary executor's biography, what his book says versus what Horsley's book says, are like really what Horsley is doing is not giving Crowley any benefit of the doubt and just sort of reading his work or his autobiographical work and the accounts of him as if they were not coded with a sort of like showmanship, but were even when they were coded, they were still sort of telling a certain truth, or that it doesn't matter if they're coded or not because of his sort of followers and that sort of thing. Like, what responsibility does someone in that position have when he has like devotees? And
I would also
yeah,
like
it's
just interject
fascinating.
real quick. I'm not even citing Vice of Kings yet. This is all, for me. This is all coming out of the Colin Wilson wonderful book, The Occult, in
Oh,
which
the
he's
occult, nice.
citing I don't think it's Simon's. I don't know, but yeah, that he's citing the Great Beast book, because there's some stuff in the Vice of Kings that maybe I'll save for the Patreon. That's like, it's it's
Dark.
it's really dark, and it's like the sources on it are a bit thinner,
Sure. Yeah. Um,
but yeah, I
yeah, the
mean,
Great Beast is very solid. I've also been having a look at this really interesting. It's a Aleister Crowley's Four Books of Magic. It's the entirety of the Liber ABA. So it's book four, Magic in Theory and Practice, one of the yoga books, and uh, the Book of the Law. But it has this really solid introduction by Stephen Skinner, who's sort of a familiar name to anyone in these waters, and it gives this really helpful chronology, which kind of just shows you the pace at which this guy was, first of all, going through women, uh, utterly insane, and like the bridges, like even like Israel Regardi, who was kind of working for him as the Serpent, as his secretary or something like that, and just and what he did to Victor Newberg, this poet, he kind of took on this journey with him. Not to put the cart before the horse, but just to give a sense for what this kind of guy was doing in terms of using people. Yeah, it's crazy. I think yeah, not yesterday. Last time we had an episode, I mentioned somebody had come into the shop and said they don't want to like read Crowley because he's a narcissist, and as opposed to the usual reason of his books are cursed or something, which I don't think.
uh,
I actually think his books are pretty interesting and like the writing is interesting, and his goal of approaching magic as a sort of psychological science interesting. The Thelema is interesting. I don't like Crowley. Like I feel like uh, neither of us are like big fans of Crowley. We're just acknowledging his importance and that if we're talking about this East meets West magical development. He's kind of like uh, the central peg of that.
Hmm.
But um, yeah, just looking at his life is bonkers. He just goes everywhere. His travels are so interesting.
He's everywhere. Like there's a whole saga where he's early days. He's performing acts of ceremonial magic in Mexico City, and
Yeah,
he's describing the prostitutes that he's like employing for these works of magic and stuff, and that's when he gets really unsatisfied and despondent because he's actually materializing acts of magic, and he thinks for himself that there has to be something greater to it.
yeah,
Um, but I think, yeah, for me, it's really interesting the feedback loop and the reflexivity of fiction and magic for Crowley. Like I mentioned earlier, being inspired by 1001 Arabian Nights is really funny because that translation and import into the West is kind of like an early warning shot of later Orientalism to come, and so it's just the Egyptomania of like the opening of King Tut's tomb and this the
yeah.
the constant like relationship to the interpretation of Egypt without actually knowing or being able to study a lot of the realities of Egypt, because I don't even think the Rosetta Stone was decoded at that point. Um, and his,
Yeah.
a major influence of his was also Gerald Massey, who was proclaimed himself to be, an Egyptologist, but he'd never been to Egypt. He knew nothing of Egypt. He just made a lot of shit up.
That's like Lao Sang Rampa.
Totally, absolutely, yeah. And it's crazy too because a lot of what Gerald Massey said uh, is maintained today. Like even in that Zeitgeist film, when they're in the beginning of the movie, how they're talking about the similarities between Christ and Horus, that comes directly from Gerald Massey. And all the stuff about Horus isn't really true. Like Horus didn't have 12
Yeah.
apostles and all this shit. It's just like
Oh, sure. Yeah.
made up, like, and
I like that though. It just goes to show you that you can just like lie and make stuff up and people will still be saying it 150 years later.
it's still,
It's
and it's
like
still,
inspiring.
it's still in a lot of like new age shit and all of that, like the light of the world,
Yeah.
Gerald Massey, like all that stuff is still out there and circulating. So, you got to look into these things, which is what's great about this Pulp Magic series is kind of really pulling the carpet up on this shit and taking a look what's under there, what died
Yeah.
under there.
I mean, it's kind of like the Egypt thing is almost like, two-thirds of the story with Crowley because that's where he receives this Book of the Law, which is his channeled text. And I kind of love how the Book of the Law is not really considered in the context of like 20th century or 19th century channeled text. Like you don't think of it in the same breath as like Owaspe or Urantia or anything. And it's really no better than any of those. It like has this
Yeah.
gravity to it because of his wickedest man in the world, reputation has this gravity, whereas we don't even remember the name of the guy who did Owaspe. Like, I mean, we do, but like off the top of your head, like,
Hmm.
and I think he was a dentist, like, like,
Yeah, no, you're right about
uh,
that. And it's interesting, depending on who you talk to, whether they'll talk about it as a channel text or not. And I think even
right.
among his acolytes, there's different interpretations of that. Um, but certainly it is a channel text. What I find funny about it is that it's like it's decorated with this Egyptian faux exterior, like this
Yeah.
facade, but it's not Egyptian at all. And
The philosophy, he probably doesn't even know.
he doesn't
Like,
know.
no,
Yeah.
right.
And it's like, it's almost comical because he goes to Egypt with his new wife Rose Kelly,
Yeah.
and she says that she's channeling Horus, and then the famous story that they're in the museum, and she points to an adaptation of the god Horus. I'm forgetting off the top of my head, and I will butcher which incarnation of Horus it is, but it's not Horus, but it's a younger incarnation of Horus.
Is it like Harpocrates or Rahar,
Pot,
like something like
yeah,
that? Yeah.
yeah. Let's just guess, but it's
It is.
obviously the number is on the exhibit is 666, and he's like, well, it's me, the great beast, of course. And,
Yeah.
of course, he's so wealthy that they are allowed to spend an evening in the Great Pyramid of Giza for their honeymoon. Who on earth? That's where
Yeah.
I think it's important to not forget that this is just some like random dude who fucking inherited a shitload of money and had the most insane penchant for impressing his will upon the world. The combination
Yeah.
of those two things is what creates the atom bomb of Aleister Crowley on Earth. And, that's why people remember the Book of the Law. That's why the Book of the Law is a thing, because if you read it, it's not really that remarkable. Am I wrong? Like
I like it as it's like a really good channeled sort of verse religious text. It's really interesting, but because it's so violent and dark, it like really contrasts with like the other texts that were, and especially the later ones that were all about like peace and love. This is about like war and will and this like turning almost like a pole shift of the world. And so it's like very bracing and interesting, but it's not like
it's Swinburnian. That's what
yeah,
that's
I
what
guess kind of.
that's what fucking Colin Wilson says in the occult so much,
That's
is referring to it as
that's such
Swinburnian.
a yeah, that's such a Colin Wilsonism. He's like such
Yeah.
a yeah, everything's like well, yeah, he's funny.
But he points, he's pointing again to a source, Algernon Charles Swinburne, and obviously
Yeah,
Nietzsche, and the spoke Zarathustra, and those aforementioned pastiche biblical verses by Oscar Wilde. And there's a lot of contemporary stuff like the Book of the Law that
hmm.
also had its finger on the same pulse. Now, it sounds like I'm diminishing it completely, and obviously he had a good sense of where the world was going and predicting a lot of what was to come, especially with the Great Wars, and I think also like the kind of like the path of like sexuality in America, and not just like the free love thing, but also
How
really.
so? I saw that mentioned in Vice of Kings, I think, and I just don't know. I mean, he certainly was talking about like uh interesting gender stuff, but like yeah,
The amalgamation of sexual opposites and the perfect person being hermaphroditic and stuff like that is what he's
right.
saying.
Yeah, sure.
I'm not trying to offend anybody by making those two comparisons, but I think that if you go into a greater analysis of some of the things that he's writing, it talks about a more cultural openness to transsexuality, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. And it's not, it's a lot of things. Like he had his finger on the pulse of the cultural abandonment of organized religion, which we're not obviously not quite there yet, but certainly over the course of 100 years, it's probably happened more than it ever
Yeah.
has, right?
Yeah. But he was also I feel like yeah, we shouldn't skip over how important the Golden Dawn was to him. Like that was
Yeah,
uh because he didn't just like come out of like school and be like, I'm gonna just, fucking throw it all to the wind and I'm gonna start my own religion and I'm God. Like he was certainly like a headstrong kind of guy, but he was kind of initiated into this whole thing through McGregor Mathers and that sort of that really interesting. I mean, that would need its entire own series to talk about the Golden Dawn, and Crowley's role in it is maybe even beyond the scope of the episode today. But his entrance into that is kind of like, and going up that sort of spiritual ladder is sort of what boosted him into this position where he could, um,
And of course, it all roads lead
yeah,
back to theosophy as well, because the Golden Dawn was chartered by a German theosophical lodge when Mathers started it. And obviously, like Mathers claimed that he answered to the secret chiefs. So there's the connection to
right,
theosophy, and it's clear that Crowley admired Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. And at one point, when he came to America, he went to California and he met with Catherine Tingley, who was running the West Coast Theosophical operation in, was it Sacramento or was it San Diego? I think it was San Diego. Loma Land. You remember what I'm
yeah,
talking? And
yeah, yeah,
he met with her, and he was actually trying to bridge Thelema and Theosophy, and she denied him because she thought she saw Theosophy as this academic and positive study of world religion and this like societal upstanding movement, and that Crowley having anything to do with it was awful. But it's kind of ironic because I read that in the Theater of the Occult Revival, which is a wonderful book by Edmund B. Lingen. Lingen.
let me see.
This is a Palgrave Macmillan.
You buy that from me?
Yeah.
I remember that book.
Did you read it?
No.
Loser. But this book's cool because it's all about theater, and
Yeah, yeah,
it talks about Crowley was a prolific playwright early on, and that's his want to be accepted as a great poet, a great
yeah.
writer, and a great playwright was something that is backfills his
I
life
love it.
story as well, and never really, certainly never getting that acclaim. I think the most that he really got was for his rites of the Eleusinian Mysteries, which he commissioned to have performed out of his own pocket, of course.
Yeah,
And there were some write-ups, mostly negative, but it actually seemed like a pretty potent ceremonial piece of theater. And Catherine
right.
Tingley was at Loma Land in California. They had a Greek style theater there, and one of the things they were most known for was performing these magical rites and play in ceremonies through magical theater. And
Mm.
I think Crowley is a great theatric, and that's kind of one of the things that he brings to the party as well, is that like through his use of theater and performance, he's able to reify these insane concepts and things that he's writing about and amalgamating. Give me one sec. My
Yeah.
mic just cut out all weird for a second.
Um, yeah, he definitely has a theatrical flair, and the poetry aspect of it is really interesting. I recently came across a copy of like it's just called The Collected Works of Aleister Crowley, Volume One, and it's like his poetry up to that point. And um, yeah, most of it's like not particularly good. Some of it's interesting because the themes he lays out in it will later kind of be developed into his magical writings, which are actually not badly written and are really kind of interesting and like framed in really odd ways. Often because he's trying to sort of encode things or to make it apparent to some people and totally cloudy to others. So he kind of does these interesting tricks. But yeah, the poetry is really strange, and his interaction with, I guess, to step back a second, the Golden Dawn had all these really important literary figures kind of hanging around. Yeats, of
Hmm.
course, is like the big one that people associate with Crowley because of this kind of infamous snub that Yeats does of Crowley's poetry, who is really just looking for like a, like a knowing nod, between poets, as you do. And what he got was like, oh, like,
You
Yeats, who is like
suck.
really one of the
Yates was like,
greatest.
"You suck, dude."
Yeah, it's just like, don't quit the whatever, don't quit being rich.
Don't put your sword away or
And
whatever. Yeah.
yeah, so that was big, but a sort of a side note into the Grant realm, is how weird it is that so part of Grant's Crowley thing is this connection between Crowley and Lovecraft, and that there's
Mm.
this knowledge thing, this somehow shared knowledge, this shared mythology that's sort of coded through each other. And Lovecraft, of course, was never a member of the Golden Dawn Theosophy. He was interested in the things a bit,
Read a lot of
but it's
theosophical texts.
but it's overplayed to say that he like was putting secret theosophical messages in his books, I think. I don't think that the actual textual evidence is there, although the context is there. Um, but the people who were really big influences on Lovecraft, Machen and Blackwood, were uh, Golden Dawn members or sort of associates at certain times. So the Golden Dawn influence on weird fiction is very real, and even so much as to be foundational in some ways. Like some like Macken's some of Macken's writings are directly inspired by his time in occult investigations, like in The Great God Pan, or in sort of speculations about the nature of these disincarnate entities. Like, and these were the guys who were really influencing Lovecraft's vision of this sort of what would later be branded as like the Cthulhu mythos.
Hmm.
And so that's something Grant gets into obviously a lot in his works, but it's something that's not totally far-fetched. Like he's not like just grasping at straws. There really is a connection between this turn of the century occultism and weird fiction. It's just not a direct connection with Lovecraft. It's sort of a
And
chain.
it's funny because it even goes back. There's links in that chain that goes back further into this like ping pong truth fiction thing because Bulwer Lytton was an
Sure.
acolyte of Eliphas Levi, and
Yeah.
Bulwer Lytton's fiction was super influential to the magical revival in London. Like that is kind of what caused a lot of this resurgence to be of interest to people, and obviously the Vril
Yeah.
stuff was heavily influential to Blavatsky and Theosophy.
You know what keeps me up at night? Do you think Harry Potter is the reason for the sort of 2010s occult revival?
I don't know. That's interesting. That's pulpy, baby.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and there's so much stuff that kind of like there's little stuff about the Egyptomania, which I find really interesting too. Like I think Ida Craddock,
Hmm.
actually, who we talked about with Steph Quick, who's kind of a pioneer in writing about sex magic. Um, she actually wrote a review defending this like subversive belly dance performance that was happening at the World's Fair, where I think also Cagliostro's Egyptian rites were happening,
Hmm.
just to kind of paint a picture of what that time looked like. And I don't know how explosive that aesthetic of Egypt was. And it's not the first time, obviously. Like every time somebody went to conquer Egypt, they kind of just adopted the aesthetic, right? Like the Greeks and
Because it's so cool.
the
Yeah.
Romans, yeah, and that kind of never went
Like,
away.
yeah. Every time
Um,
somebody hears shoegaze, they do that.
yeah, and even like we won't be able to talk about it tonight, but reading through the Rites of the Mummy, which is the newest kind of thelemic treatise, I suppose,
Hmm.
This came out in like 2020, and it's from the Carla Cell. It's The Secret Key to the Book of the Law by Jeffrey Evans, who's an acolyte of Kenneth Grant, and Peter Lavenda. Obviously, this is, pretty pulp Egyptomania in a
Yeah.
kind of demented way, but this is a really cool book. Maybe that will be a sort of addendum to Pulp Magic, revisiting that one in a deeper context. But even when we
Hmm.
consider the reception of the Book of the Law, the way that I see it in my head is almost like a genie out of 1001 Arabian Nights sort of communicating in the corner of the
You mean
room
Iwas?
to Aleister Crowley. There's a very jinn aspect that comes right out of 1001 Arabian Nights, and it's
Hmm.
ironic because Crowley then finds so much use in the Goetia, which
Right.
is sort of an early Western adaptation of jinn conjuration, right? I mean,
Hmm.
I think there's a pretty strong case for that.
Um, yeah, but so yeah, that's obviously an interesting, East-West connection. So yeah, Thelema is basically an Eastern religion in some ways then, right? It's coming out of an inception point in Cairo, Egypt. But of course, it's Western in its sort of philosophical framework, which is an anti-Christian. It's like it could only have been developed by a Christian, right? Like, or by someone who's familiar with, or someone who has something to rebel against, I guess.
I would say
Because it's
yeah, sorry to interrupt.
hmm?
I just think instead of it's almost like a mystery Babylon religion, right? I think that's what it feels
Yeah,
most akin to.
sure. I mean, yeah, mystery religion, and
Babylon,
obviously,
especially. Like,
well, yeah, sure, but I don't know
not that it's
because
directly influenced, but I think that's an early place where there was, a cultural melting pot occurring. And
yeah,
something like this could be chimerically constructed there. You can envision that, where it
sure,
seemed Egypt had something more isolated and pure.
but it is post-Christian. The Book of the Law I'm talking about,
Sure.
like
Yeah, absolutely.
it's not so yeah, so it's something that's coming from the a Western understanding of Eastern, Near Eastern mythology. So it's Egypt by way of Crowley's reality tunnel, if you will. It's yeah. So in that way, Thelema and sort of the entire occult culture that orbits around Crowley is this kind of, exotic understanding of the East, the order of Oriental Templars or, Templars in the Orient, that whole thing that Crowley sort of eventually subsumed. Uh, or, he was someone who was accused of plagiarizing their stuff. And sort of by the end of it, he was restructuring the entire organization.
Yeah, completely.
Um, and that's another secret society uh, that Crowley was involved with after the Golden Dawn.
And he learned of Eastern mysticism from Alan Bennett, who was his fellow member of the Golden Dawn. And Crowley, while still having some of his inheritance, actually pays for Alan Bennett to go move to the East and study more seriously Buddhism. And
Yeah,
Crowley goes to visit him and claims that he sees him levitating 4 feet off the ground in a temple and blowing around like a leaf, is what he said. And
that's cool.
meanwhile, Crowley's out there big game hunting and,
Right.
getting like 3 prostitutes a night and all this stuff.
He's like such a upper class British guy. Like
Yeah.
you can just like see him in his little outfit, like trying to track whatever kind of crazy animals are out there. Yeah, it's kind of bizarre. And then the mountaineering stuff, of course, too, is a big part of the Crowley lore, which is another sort of a vaguely Orientalist tradition, which I'm not coming for like the rock climbers
It
who might be listening. You're
is
rock
true though.
climbing,
Yeah, that's interesting.
yeah, like climbing Everest and like getting into Tibet basically is what it's a yeah, it's a colonial hobby. I don't that's not fair, but and I'm not like trying to be weird about it, but it's a layer of the Crowley personality that is very in tune with his sort of interest in absorbing and repurposing Eastern mysticism for his own ends.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're about at an hour, and I think we can kind of maybe put some closing thoughts on the public portion and move over to Patreon. But I guess my question to you is what makes Aleister Crowley pulp?
Well, I
Because he's
mean,
taken quite seriously. So,
yes,
the the word pulp, I don't think that we haven't really employed pulp in the sense of like amazing stories and that kind
right.
of pulp fiction that people are used to the word being used, although certainly there's a case that all of that is in there. I think it's the cross influence of fiction, whether it be literary or cultural fictions, and their influences on Western occultism and the Western occult tradition and the thin
Right.
ground that it stands on, I think is really our pulp in this
Yeah. Well,
thing.
in some ways, Crowley is literally a pulp author. Like Diary of a Drug Fiend is a
Hmm.
basically a noirization, pulpization of his. I guess it's not really noir, but it's like it's a popular fictionalization of his time as sort of a leader at the Abbey of Thelema and um, attempting to cure these young cocaine addicts. It's like it's a fictional demonstration of his powers as a guru in a very ironic way, given where he ends up a couple of decades later as a very serious heroin addict. And so in that way, he's a pulp author. His life story, which we didn't even get into, like the magical war
We'll
stuff or his
we'll we'll
espionage.
talk about a lot more of the biography and detestable acts of Satanism, or
Uh-huh.
all the crazy interesting stuff. And I think we'll also talk a little bit about Austin Osman Spare, who crossed paths with
Ugh.
Crowley, and maybe shout out Pascal Beverly Randolph and
Woo.
some other characters who
Yeah.
influenced this story on the Patreon. So definitely check that out.
Yeah.
It's
Swing on over there.
$5 a month, and that's nothing because that's like
Not
the price
anymore.
of a fucking muffin.
That's the price of
Just do it. Just sign up.
yeah.
Because that's really not that much, and it makes us feel good about what we do, and it takes a lot of work, and it's almost sometimes exhausting to because sometimes you don't like it's when we started Pulp a couple months ago. It's very exciting when you have these ideas, but when you're knee deep back in Crowleyana,
Yeah, that's tough.
you start looking at saucers in the sky, and you're like, oh, it looks pretty good right now.
Yeah, I want to talk about a disc-shaped object. That sounds really cool.
Yeah. Um, I
Yeah,
would
right.
say, yeah, for me, why is Crowley pulp? I think that his character is pulp. I think
Yeah.
that, and especially now, I think that Crowley exists between book pages. I think that's why he's
Mm.
pulp. I think, much like H.P.V. Blavatsky and the reality of her journeys and her communications with the secret chiefs and hoaxes, um, Crowley alike, the failures of his commune in Italy, the staggering confusion of his voyages between places and astral planes, the reality of his, myths and magic. Um, all of that exists perfectly in print. It's not.
Yeah.
And when you look at it and imagine it in the real world, I think that that's not actually its place. And I
Yeah.
think if you try and picture the channeling of the Book of the Law, it might look a lot more real than you'd like it to. But this story and the lore, um, that's where it belongs. So that's why he's Pulp, and that's why he's Pulp Magic,
Mm. That's the name of the show.
and that's the name of the series. Yeah, okay. Let's. I'm trying to find this amazing quote from the Simmons thing, the Simmons biography. But do you have any last thoughts on the lad before we hop over to Patreon for our public? Oh, also if you're listening to us and you haven't listened to us in a while on the public forum, we do our printed Journal of Shells, which are coming out wonderfully. We present archival occult texts, ufological texts, new works by writers and artists. We do a lot of the design and writing ourselves as well. These things are coming out awesome. They include
Yeah.
really sick bonus printed items. The last one included this cool Halloween card and poem that we made, and posters, postcards. We have conceptual ideas coming up for the next one. So that's $10 a month, and that is a really cool deal because you get the full episode archive and our online written content, our Discord server, and all of our exclusive episodes.
Yeah, Discord. A lot of lively conversation on there. I'm sort of like uh the the hardworking president of this Discord.
The
It's
mod.
an ill-fitting suit, and so if you want to see me struggling to maintain some sort of sense of authority when I'm better suited as sort of a independent thinker, yeah, come check out the Discord. Um, as for Crowley, not a Crowley fan. I like Crowley's work sometimes. I think he's hugely important. He kind of had to be discussed in this context for this series, so I'm happy we kind of did it. It was interesting to spend some time with some different views on him, but I can only take so much. He's a lot more fun. He's a lot more fun to sell books of than he is to try to make sense of, in my experience.
He's a funny guy, though. I won't put that past him.
Yes,
He's definitely
I
got a
laugh.
good sense of humor, and inarguably inventive, inarguably strong-willed, and wealthy for a period of time until he bankrupted himself completely. I like this quote out of the Simmons book. It says, "He had tried everything, and now at the age of 50, when he could only proclaim the law of Thelema, he realized that what he really wanted was a job, some congenial work. He was thrown out of the hotel where he was living on credit."
Poor guy.
It's great stuff.
We'll all end up there.
Okay, join Patreon. Thanks for listening. We have some interviews coming up, which will be also on our public forums, but our regular content goes down on patreon.com/consensusunreality. Thanks for
.com.
listening. We'll see you next time.
Into the public episode. Now we can tell you what we really think about this
Ew.
disgusting, vile rat. Oh God!
It's just gonna be like
Just
me writing a bunch of like little paper notes where it's like Austin Osmond Spare made poop.
yeah. I was earlier today. I was looking into like Spare and all this, and because for some reason, like this hasn't always been the case. I used to like him a lot, but like for the past few years, I've just like every time somebody mentions Spare, I'm like, ugh, I just can't fucking deal with any more of this guy. I don't like the art anymore. It's just boring. Oh my